Episode number 28, Germans in Missouri. A discussion with Todd Wilkinson. Gather up the kids and the old folks. Shut down the contraptions and dim the lights. Put away your pocket-sized magic lantern shows. Close your eyes and listen. It's time to strike off on the paths less traveled, down dark trails through the hills and hollers, along the riverbanks and into the brush. Hear tales of things forgotten get told. Join me as we venture into the Wild N Woolly Ozarks. I'm your native guide and host, Champ Heron. Welcome back, gentle people. Thank you for once again finding your way to our shady side of the house. Had a little rain last night. The technology is all messed up, so I'm going to at first apologize to Paul, the producer, for having to put up with what I've had to patch together here. I'm sorry, Paul. And the best laid plans of mice and men are off to gang of glee. I think that's right, isn't it, Todd?
It's close. It's close.
Close enough. I don't think I got it right. Well, anyway, if you are joining us today, we've got a real treat for you. Something that I don't know anyone else has really unpacked, and that is, where did all these little German communities in Missouri come from? And perhaps there's some German communities near you that you didn't even know about. Why did they come here? What did they do? And what are the lasting effects on our culture today? Today's guest is a longtime friend of mine. He's been on the podcast before. We've known one another since our late teens, and my late teens. I think he was already in his 20s. And we have collaborated on numerous storytelling and Ozarks lore and different things. Now, Todd is a real academic. He's not like me. He's a real academic. He's got paper on the wall to prove it. And he sometimes it's great to have that in a collaborator, because he kind of reins me in and says, hold on a minute, champ. But anyway, Todd joins us today to lead this discussion. And I got to tell you, this is something I don't really know a lot about. But I'm interested to parse it out with my old friend Todd here. Todd, welcome back to the Wild N Woolly Ozarks.
Well, thank you for having me, and thanks for that dig about how I'm older than you. So,
Oh yeah, you've earned it.
and I will say that a diploma on the wall, that and 95 cents or whatever the cost is, will buy you a cup of coffee now. So it's certainly something to be proud of, but not too proud, as Garrison Keillor might say of his Scandinavian immigrant ancestors in Minnesota. So,
yeah, well, that's kind of the vein in which we're going today. Is that you have spent a lot of time, and let me just tell you something about my friend Todd here. Todd has spent a bunch of time searching through, as an educator, searching through local stuff and making points to his students, whether he was teaching military history or Ozarks history or just American history, how all these different cultures sort of collided and or coalesced in the Ozarks.
yeah, and that's the interesting thing about this subject, or really any immigrant group that comes to the United States, is the counterpoint that there is a lot of this, but yet still is this desire by a lot of immigrant groups to maintain their home culture, to maintain that tie. And it's really interesting because I'm interested in Scottish immigration as well. And, it's funny because the Scots will tell you that American Scots are more enthusiastic than they are in some ways about their culture. And I think we see that a lot. The folks that come to the United States, they retain something that is long gone in Norway or Germany or Scotland or whatnot. And so the folks that come from there now and come to the United States are, I think, surprised sometimes at what survived and those little cultural vestiges that are still around. Just to kind of lead off with a little bit of facts, and it's not going to be a total names and numbers sort of game here, but in 2020, in the 2020 federal census, 50 million Americans claim to be of German descent. That's about 17% of the total U.S. population. And if you Google any sort of statistics on German heritage, you're going to find maps that show high concentrations of Germans in the upper Midwest, in the Great Lakes area. You'll find a fairly large colony in Texas, in the Hill Country. That's a subject in its own story. But it's interesting that one of the highest percentages of European heritage are these, and yet there's really not a lot left culturally from most of these people. You may have a German name, but there are a lot of listeners out there that may have anglicized German names. And we're going to talk about why those names become anglicized later on. But it's an interesting fact to me that we have 17% of the population claim to be German, claiming this heritage. But again, we're seeking out what that really means. And of course, we really kind of have to go back and define what is Germany.
Todd, I know that there are multiple, from the colonial period up through the early 1900s. There are multiple immigration waves of Germanic people. Why don't you? And I think a lot of us have grown up on the post-World War II map, and we don't understand that Germany was not really a country. It was I think, as you've described it, a patchwork quilt of individual states. Is there, like 16 of them or something? Launch.
There's about 30.
There are 30. Wow. Okay.
At the time of unification, which is 1870, 1871, when you see the modern state of Germany come into being, there are 30 states that come together. The big one at that time is Prussia. And Prussia has really been the big kid on the block. But down in the south, you also have Bavaria, which really remains a quasi-independent kingdom up until around World War II. And we'll talk about Bavaria here in just a little bit. But before 1870 and this German nationalist movement that comes out of the Franco-Prussian War and these tensions that are going on in Europe, 30 roughly patchwork quilt states. They share a common culture. They especially share that common language, German. The Austrians are technically part of that because they're Germanic-speaking peoples. And if you really want to go way back into history, with the breakup of the Holy Roman Empire, you start to see these individual princely states that are formed in what becomes Germany. And each population may refer to themselves as a Rhinelander or a resident of Hesse Castle or a resident of Bavaria, but they still have that common thread in the German language and the German culture. And that really drives this nationalist movement that comes about in the late 19th century. Why did they come to the United States? Well, there's several reasons. And you talked about the waves, and I think that's important. Each wave really has its own motive in a lot of ways. The first wave of Germans coming to North America is really centered on religious toleration, religious freedom. Once we get into the 19th century, the 1800s, we start to see a lot more political and economic turmoil going on across Europe, especially in the German states. And so for the Germans, just like a lot of other immigrants, America represents a new land where it's possible to start over and to be your own person. Self-reliance is key for the Germans. Self-reliance, independence, being able to make it on your own. You can understand why America was attractive to the Germans. The first Germans that come in,
It's at the point, Todd, because I've been watching these German farming videos, and they're making hay on a 60-degree slope.
Oh yes.
I mean, they're up there, stuck up there where where you have the barn underneath the house to use the cows and the manure to heat the floor of the house because you're in the Alps.
It's funny you mentioned that, because there actually is a example of a house barn up in Franklin County, Missouri, not too far from New Haven, and that's the Pelster House Barn, and it's one of the few examples of that joint house and cow buyer that would be very common in Germany, not as common here in the United States. But again, that really speaks to that self-reliance, that independence, wanting to establish themselves and take care of themselves. And we'll get a little bit more into that here in just a little bit. But we know that the first German immigrants that come into the United States come in 1608 to the Jamestown colony. And if anybody remembers the story, John Smith, the captain of the Jamestown colony, makes the famous proclamation, "No work, no eat." And he'd had a problem with Virginia gentlemen refusing to work and labor. And he made a comment in a letter about how the German immigrants were industrious and willing to work, and much more so than the English gentlemen that he was in charge of. And again, I think they're kind of setting that stereotype that we sometimes portray, and all cultures have a stereotype that maybe has some elements of truth, but the Germans come over, they, really do want to work hard. We really don't see another major wave of Germans until the 1620s, when we start to see some Germans coming into New Amsterdam, the Dutch colony, which becomes New York. But it's really 1677. And I think that's kind of the place to start off with. And that's when the German states start to get word of a new colony in North America called Pennsylvania. And if you're not familiar with the origins of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania means Penn's Woods. And the Penn in question is William Penn, a Quaker who was the son of a British admiral who embraced the faith of the Society of Friends, established a new colony in the New World, escaping religious persecution at the hands of just about everybody in England, Anglicans, Puritans alike. And William Penn comes over, establishes his colony, doesn't take it by force per se, negotiates with the Delaware, the Lenape, and then he opens up his colony for religious toleration. And he basically says anyone is welcome in Pennsylvania. Now, if you know your colonial history, most of the colonies had a state religion. In Massachusetts, it was the Congregationalist Church. In Virginia, it was the Anglican Church. Pennsylvania has none of that. And so there are a number of Protestant sects in Germany who are persecuted, and they see Pennsylvania as a haven. And we start to see many Germans coming over, the most famous being the Amish and the Mennonites. And if you want to see what Pennsylvania German heritage looks like, there are a number of Amish and Mennonite colonies here in the Ozarks. And that's a direct tie, excuse me, in many ways to that German population that comes in. It's not just them, though. I mean, there are Palatinates from the Rhineland. We have a number of German Lutherans who come in. The Lutheran Church in Germany was going through some turmoil, and you had factions. The state church, which was more traditional and liturgical. You had the Pietist movement, which was more emotional and a personal connection to religion. So you had some Lutherans that were disagreeing over that. But for whatever reason, the Germans come into Pennsylvania. They settle in places like Philadelphia, and then they start to make their way westward in the colony. And they start to move west and then south along what we call the Great Wagon Road, which goes all the way down into the Appalachians, really all the way down into the Carolinas and eventually into Georgia itself. The Germans give us a couple of things. because of this expedition that, again, we think of as traditionally American. If you want to pick out something that's a symbol of westward migration, probably most people are going to pick out a covered wagon. The Conestoga wagon, which we associate with the 19th century westward expansion, really gets its start in the 18th century, and it's German wagon rights who have come to Pennsylvania, who create this land ship, essentially, which is going to make it a lot easier for immigrants to travel on the frontier. They also,
well, yeah, if you think where they're traveling, Todd, it has to float. It has to, it has to be able to take some jar because you're going across the Appalachians or through them or down them. Take your pick.
Yes, and you're also going to need a good rifle. And we think of Daniel Boone, we think of Davy Crockett, we think of those American frontiersmen, but the Kentucky rifle that Daniel Boone and his contemporaries would have carried was probably originally a Pennsylvania rifle, and it was probably built by a German gunsmith. And so, for sensing a theme here, the Germans are skilled artisans and craftsmen. They bring these skills to the New World with them. And then they
Let's talk about that rifle for a minute. And man, I really want one. But anyway, I don't have a flintlock. I really want one. But let's talk about that for a minute, because if you think about it, where they hunted up in the Alps would be sort of like hunting out in the American West. There's no 100-yard shots.
Yes. And in fact,
slaying game all over the place with blunderbusses, and but it's everywhere.
Shooting was a big component of German society. So much so that later on in the 1800s, we're going to see German shooting clubs formed throughout the United States. There's some great pictures online. There are still German shooting clubs in mostly Wisconsin and Minnesota, but the traditional hunting gear, hunting garb, it's really kind of a neat subculture of the German immigration. And of course, they take great pride in that work. The Kentucky rifle really is the firearm that wins the American West in many ways. And of course, for our purposes and for something that I know we're both interested in, later on, you get the Hawken rifle, which is produced in St. Louis. And as we know, Vance Randolph claims that the Hawken rifle, each one had a hex protector built into it, essentially, to keep the witches away. And of course, that's something else that I kind of bring up as we're talking about these Pennsylvania Dutch is people think of Pennsylvania Dutch, which, by the way, they're not Dutch. That's the American corruption of their term for themselves, Deutschland.
Mm-hmm.
But Americans hear Deutsch and they think Dutch. But the Pennsylvania Dutch are noted for having their hex signs on their barns out in Pennsylvania, and that supposedly keeps the witches away. There's no truth to that whatsoever. That was actually something that came up in the 40s or 50s, if I remember correctly. But it's kind of that
more decorative version of okay. So those are more decorative versions of something found in a book called The Seals of Solomon, or there's a whole bunch of Solomon.
Correct.
Who knows how old they are? Who knows if they're authentic? Who knows if they were really what Solomon did or did not do? I have no clue. We're not going to get into it here. But the point is, when 150 or 200 years later, Vance Randolph is writing about Ozark magic, witchcraft, faith healing, and power doctoring. Okay. He's referring, it is a remnant of German folk magic, which was actually codified in a book called The Long Lost Friend, which is what powwow practitioners in Pennsylvania still practice to this day. So if you like that, check out our episode with Justin Miner.
Yes. And I was thinking about that when I was writing the notes for this. So the Germans come in, they settle in Western Pennsylvania, they make their way down the wagon road. We start to find Germans in the Appalachians. You'll find a fairly large colony of Moravians that are German Protestants, fairly liberal German Protestants who settle in North Carolina. There's still elements.
What it means to be sorry to stop you, but unpack what it means to be a Moravian, just so for the listener to know. What does that mean?
Well, and I'm not a theologian, but the Moravians are a kind of a German Quaker in a very rude, simplistic way to describe that. And that's probably not 100% correct, but just kind of thinking on my feet there, the Moravian society has a lot in common with the Quakers. And again, think about all of those populations, the Amish, the Mennonites, the Quakers, the Moravians. They're usually pacifists. They reject a lot of European trappings that were quite common. Think about William Penn's being the son of an admiral, and now he's a pacifist Quaker. So you can understand why these groups feel safe coming to Pennsylvania. We know, for example, Daniel Boone had Quaker stock. He came from a Quaker family that immigrated from England. And there's a reason why Boone, even though he's a great shot with that Kentucky rifle, Boone is generally not an Indian fighter like many of the Scots-Irish would be there on the frontier. You can literally find them anywhere in the 13 colonies. They're in New York. They eventually make their way out to the frontier. But by 1745, we have about 40,000 Germans living in Pennsylvania. And of course, a lot of those communities that are settled in Pennsylvania still maintain that German identity. The Pennsylvania Dutch is very that culture is very strong in Pennsylvania to this day. My personal connection to it is that we labored under the delusion for years and years that my mother's maiden name was Pennsylvania Dutch. They were from Pennsylvania, and come to find out they were actually Swedes that had intermarried with the Pennsylvania Dutch because there was a Swedish colony in Pennsylvania. And it's the Swedes and the Finns that give us the log cabin. Again, another quintessential frontier item comes from this group of people that brought it with them and adapted it.
Culturally, the English were sawyers. The English had kits, and they got, because they're on an island and you deal with whatever you have, but you would saw, and this is what launched English shipbuilding, was the invention of the saw.
Boy, if you want to see a really good depiction of that, there's a great movie, and it's a little off topic, but it works, called A Canterbury Tale, which came out in World War II. And it's kind of a Why We Fight movie, but it's introducing Americans to English culture. And there's a whole discussion between an American GI from Oregon and a woodwright there in Canterbury, and they're finding out that they do a lot of things in the same way, even though there's some years between his people coming to the United States and leaving England. And it kind of speaks to this whole point that I'm trying to make, that so much of what we think of as American culture today really comes from somewhere else, whether it's a Conestoga wagon or a Pennsylvania rifle. We'll talk about some other things that come in here in a little bit. We start to see Germans pushing across the Mississippi River in the 1790s. And the first German colony that really establishes itself here in Missouri comes about that time period at the invitation of the Spanish. And we have a gentleman from North Carolina named George Bollinger, who comes in and brings a group of Moravians with him into the area just north of Cape Girardeau along the Whitewater River. And that colony becomes known as the Whitewater Dutch. And there's still some elements of that here at Montauk, where I work. One of our campground hosts is from over in that area, and he comes from Whitewater Dutch stock. And it's interesting to hear him talk with a very pronounced Southern accent, as you would find in the Boot Heel, but then to hear him speak German. And he grew up speaking German. So you do find those remnants. And you can go visit the Whitewater Dutch, one of their important sites today, in Bollinger Mill, which is a Missouri State Park. And it's built very sturdy. It's brick. It's meant to last. And again, when we think of Germans on the frontier versus the Scots-Irish, which are their next largest competitors, the Scots-Irish throw everything up ramshackle. They expect it to fall down in a couple of years. They're moving on anyway. So they really don't build anything to last per se. But boy, the Germans come in and the Germans lay down roads on right angles and they build strong structures that are meant to last. Their gardens are a mixture of utilitarian and beauty. They're not English flower gardens. You have flowers growing right next to cabbages. And that kitchen garden, as the Germans would call it, again, represents order, it represents stability, and it represents resilience. And maybe that's the three buzzwords of Germans, in that regard. That's kind of what you find in that German culture. So the thing that really tips German immigration off in Missouri, and I think, we can trace it to one man in some ways, and that's a fellow named Gottfried Duden. And keep that in mind, keep that name, because in 1829, Gottfried Duden publishes the first travel guide. He's the travel blogger for Missouri back in the German states. He comes over here, he settles in the Fimo Sage country up along modern-day Highway 94. He's a neighbor of Daniel Boone, and Daniel Boone actually comes to Missouri after the Revolutionary War. He dies here. He's buried here for a short time. And this German, who probably was not a frontiersman on any stretch of the imagination, settles relatively close to Daniel Boone in what becomes Warren County, Missouri. And he starts thinking about writing a travel guide, essentially. This is the land of milk and honey to Duden. The Missouri River Valley looks a lot like the Rhineland. It looks like the Rhine River. And we know that Duden probably came in some years of plenty when there weren't as many famines or crop failures or problems with cold weather. And so he gets kind of a skewed look of Missouri. But he basically self-publishes this book, A Journey to the Western States. And he says, look, here's a country where there's no kings. Everyone elects their own government. You can choose your own occupation, where you live, who you marry. You don't have to ask permission from the government basically to do anything. And there's even a phrase, where the sun of freedom shines. Now, he publishes this and sends it back to Germany. And a lot of people in established areas like the media and government kind of snicker at it and go, well, can this really be true? Is it impossible? But a lot of people in Germany who are suffering under political and economic and religious turmoil read Duden and they're like, wow, we got to go. We can literally,
let's go.
We can build a new Germany in this land called Missouri. And we start to see immigration societies forming. So, for example, Hermann, Missouri, which is probably, I think it's safe to say, the capital of German Missouri in many ways. St. Louis would probably disagree with that. But Hermann is established in the 1830s by an immigrant aid society out of Philadelphia to create a German colony there where the Gasconade meets the Missouri, and to basically create a new Germany where German customs, German language, German religion, all essentially would be in this new world, and at the same time taking advantage of the political and economic liberties that the United States offers. And Germany is overpopulated. There's a lot of people living there. It's hard to make it. And so by the 1830s, over 120,000 Germans immigrate to the United States. About a third of them go to Missouri. And a lot of that is due to Gottfried Duden. Duden really is that voice in the wilderness, so to speak, who's championing, I can't say that, championing, he's the one basically arguing for Missouri settlement. Now,
Right.
The Germans are really going to pick up in a decade. Duden brings in quite a few, but what Duden starts, the year 1848, really culminates in German immigration. And 1848 is the year of revolutions in Europe. It's when almost every nation in Europe experiences, directly or indirectly, some sort of political revolution. And not to go too deep in the weeds, but we have the American Revolution in 1776. the French Revolution in 1789. And then we get into the whole Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon is defeated in 1815. And there's a wave of conservatism that comes back into Europe after Napoleon's defeat. The powers that be in Prussia and Russia and even England, the old aristocracy in France, they don't want liberty, fraternity, and equality ever again. And so there's a little bit of a backlash. The pendulum swings right. And by 1848, there are a lot of people in the German states that live in essentially a glorified police state. Prussia, in particular, is cementing its power. Prussia has risen from an obscure little state there on the Baltic Sea to a military powerhouse, and they're very aware that power is fleeting, and so there's a lot of political skullduggery, and a lot of German states don't want to be ruled by that. So whatever the powder keg is, in 1848, you have revolutions that just break out, the summer of revolutions, and barricades are erected in Berlin, and revolts happen in Paris and Dublin and everywhere. And there are a number of Germans that revolt against Prussian rule, people like Franz Siegel. And if you're familiar with the story of the Battle of Wilson's Creek outside of Springfield, Franz Siegel was a German officer, a German-American officer who had been a teacher in Germany. He had also been a military officer in his home state of Baden. And for about 6 months during the 1848 revolution, Franz Siegel was able to successfully hold off a Prussian counter-revolution. Before that failed, the might of Prussia was too great, and Siegel was forced to immigrate to the United States, where he went to St. Louis. And many of these so-called 48ers, and that becomes the slang term, start coming to the United States, and they see the United States as a place of exile. Again, like their past contemporaries, American political and economic liberty really appeal to them. There's some religious aspects to it as well. During this time period, we start to see the rise of Lutheranism as we know it in the United States. The Missouri Synod Lutheran Church really comes out of this period. But for the 48ers, America is the dream. It's the ideal. And what you can't do at home behind a barricade in Germany, you can do here. And once they get here, they still maintain their identity, but they embrace everything that they see as good about America, and they oppose everything that they see as bad. And probably the most famous example, excuse me just a second. Probably the most famous example of what they see as bad in American society is slavery. So the Germans become very staunch.
Which is really understandable.
Go ahead.
When we don't think about these things now, but you and I do because we're historians. But you don't think of the fact that most of the Germanic people were slaves. They were frequently conscripted into the army. And it was an ongoing thing. It was generational. It had not changed for, since Frederick the Great or before that.
That's a really good point. And it brings up something that I forgot to bring up when we were talking about the 18th century. But most Americans know the bad guys in the Revolution are the British and their Hessian mercenaries. And you'll see that term thrown around quite a bit, Hessians, although they were from a variety of states. They weren't mercenaries
Hold on. I'm a Hessian with no aggression.
Thank you, Yosemite Sam, because that's where most people think about it. Yeah, I'm a Hessian with no aggression. And here's the thing. The Hessians weren't mercenaries. They were a military force. They were auxiliaries. The British had treaties with German states like Hesse Castle or Hanover to provide auxiliaries, but not necessarily mercenaries. They weren't what we think of as mercenaries. Mercenary was hung on them as a slur. Tom Jefferson mentions that in the Declaration. It's interesting that a lot of those Hessians chose to stay in America. They were either captured as prisoners of war, and when they were paroled, they stayed here, or when the war was over, they just stayed. So there are people descended of Hessian soldiers living in America today. And again, like you said, they're either they're conscripts or they're indentured servants. And so when they get over here and they see slavery, which counteracts everything that is supposed to be the ideal of America, all men are created equal, that really upsets them. If they can't fight Prussian slavery in Europe, they'll at least keep it out of their homeland. And they become very patriotic. They love America, but they are very concerned about the direction America is heading in. When a new political party forms in 1854 in Ripon, Wisconsin, and I think that's, telling too, it's a little ironic because there's so many Germans in Wisconsin, the Republican Party, which is a radical liberal party, which is calling for, some of them are calling for the end of slavery. The Republicans or the Germans rush to the colors, so to speak. That becomes their new club that they're a member of. They form their shooting clubs and their singing clubs. And some of your listeners may be familiar with the Turners, which were an athletic club. It was a gymnastic club started by a man named Turner John. And there were Turner clubs in St. Louis and Milwaukee and Cincinnati. And think about that. That's a triangle, that German triangle,
Sure.
Between Milwaukee, St. Louis, and Cincinnati. And they also embrace that new political ideal.
Well, I'll tell you what, let's take a little break here. We're going to hear a few words from the sponsors, and then when we come back, Todd, we're going to unpack, because we're right up basically at the edge of the Civil War, and we're going to give the second half of this thing. Hey folks, I want to talk to you about Tasty Acres strawberries and more. It's a wonderful little project that my niece and nephew, Devin and Peyton, have taken on, and little Sawyer, he's the cute little kid in the pictures. You got to follow them on Facebook. And I got to tell you, it's so much more than strawberries. I actually said strawberries in the last episode mistakenly that they had them. I meant to say peaches. And I got to tell you, peach ice cream is available. So go get you some fresh peaches. Get you some tomatoes and make that salsa, make that pot of gazpacho, or just slice them up and eat them with bacon or put them on a big hamburger. They got peppers, they got squash, cucumbers, more things than we've got time to list. So Tasty Acres, strawberries and more, $34.95 East State Highway AA in Springfield. Be sure to give them a like on Facebook and follow them there, because there's always something new at Tasty Acres. Thank you kindly. One of the things that's nice about the podcast is in the middle, I get to tell you to do a couple of things. For those of you that already have your phone out, if you're on Facebook, I would like for you to go ahead and give us a like and give us a follow. If you're on Spotify or Apple, do so there. And heck, we appreciate those 5-star reviews, folks. We really do. It helps us grow the podcast. It helps us build up something, and it's going to help us improve. And maybe buy me some elocution lessons or something like that, although I don't fiddle with electricity much. At any rate, I wanted to point out that in the Ozarks, as Todd's going to tell us here in a minute, there are German festivals to this day. So be sure, if you're interested in this episode and you like this episode, be sure to look in your area to see if there's a German festival. And also, if you get a chance to hear old Todd Wilkinson lecture or tell stories or talk about the Ozarks or talk about rivers or any of the things that he does, check it out because he does a great job. Folks, I want to talk to you for a minute about Penny Pincher Discount Grocery, 537 East Jackson, Marshfield, Missouri, 3 blocks due east of the four-way stop. The deals are always hot at Penny Pincher's. We had a big week, man. We had a big load, or actually had several. Just great stuff. This is a Facebook-based enterprise. So if you want to know what we've got, the best thing you can do is go over to Facebook, give us a follow there, Penny Pincher's Discount Grocery. There's another Penny Pincher somewhere, but I think it's out of state. So we're not really concerned about them. But if you put Penny Pincher's Marshfield, you'll find it. Sarah and staff do a great job there. We run a clean operation. You can check the inspection reports. And you can go in and take a look for yourself. It is load days are Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and there is a feeding frenzy afterwards. So if you see it online, go in and get it. So give Penny Pincher's Discount Grocery in Marshfield a like on Facebook and follow them for deals and offers. And now back to Germans in the Ozarks, our discussion with Todd Wilkinson. Todd, welcome back.
Thank you, and that was quite the plug. And there are some German festivals. We'll get into that a little bit more here in just a little bit. But there are a few areas still in Missouri that you can go and kind of get a slice of life about what these festivals might have been like. And that's kind of a good segue into the next thing, because as these Germans come in the 40s and 50s, the 1840s and 50s, there's a lot of backlash against them. There are a lot of so-called Native Americans. And when I say that term, I'm talking about white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans. Here in Missouri, that's largely going to be the Scots-Irish, but up in New England, it might be those folks of English Puritan stock that don't necessarily like the new neighbors. We also see a fairly strong Irish movement in America at this time period. So you have the Irish and the Germans coming in, and there's a lot of discrimination against what becomes known as Paddy and Hans. And there's depictions of cartoons of both of those immigrants. And in particular, religion is a thing that is not liked. The Irish in particular, but Bavarians and Southern Germans tend to mostly be Catholic, Roman Catholic. And there's a long-standing anti-Catholic tradition among some populations in North America that don't really like the idea of these papists coming in, and there's concern about loyalty to a foreign prince. There are riots. There's the Philadelphia Bible riots in the 1840s, where people literally threatened to burn down churches and convents, and lurid tales of what goes on and that sort of thing. There's another segment of Germans that come over, and they come out of that 48 Revolution tradition, who are free thinkers. They are unorthodox religious. They may not be Christians at all. They may claim to be atheists. They may claim to be rationalists. But you do see some Germans who embrace education and academia. Here you go, folks. Here's another example. most children today in the United States, before they go to first grade, they go to something called kindergarten, which means children's garden. So ironic, we're talking about gardens and vegetables and that sort of thing. The Germans bring with them a very strong sense of education. Only the Scots probably are more educated in some ways. But the Germans bring that, and Americans adopt that idea of kindergarten, the child's garden, as a way to get children ready for a more formal education. But there's a lot of opposition, whether it's Catholic, Lutheran, freethinker, whatnot, because of what the Germans do in their free time. And for those of you who may be familiar with something called the Protestant work ethic, there's a long-standing tradition in America. It goes back to the Puritan and Pilgrim days of working hard, and you may not get ahead, but you deserve anything you get because of original sin and Calvinism and all sorts of things. And on Sunday is the day you go to church, and then you don't really do anything else. You don't cook, you don't work. The Germans don't believe in that. The Irish don't necessarily believe in that either. They believe in going to church. They go to mass or they go to divine service. But to their tradition, which historians call a continental Sunday, they believe that right after mass or divine service, you go to the beer garden and you lift a few tankards. And of course, the Germans change our drinking habits as well. Again, here's something to ponder. During the American Revolution, most Americans, if they consumed alcohol, they consumed rum if they were on the coast. And then later on in the frontier, they consumed whiskey, which was easy to make. And as Champ and I've talked about, it's the easiest way to get a crop of corn to market in the Ozarks, based on
Well, and they drank
transportation.
cider rather than beer.
Right. They did drink cider.
Beer, but cider will naturally ferment and hold to a degree.
Yes. So the Germans bring with them their tradition of beer making, of brewing, and they bring a new style of beer, and it's called lager beer, and that refers to how the beer is stored. And they find very quickly that in parts of Missouri, for example, you can store your beer in a cool place like a cave, a lagering cave. And that's why in a lot of breweries, under breweries in St. Louis or Springfield, you will find lagering caves. Back in 2017 in Springfield, the city of Springfield accidentally dug up one of the lagering caves of the old Dingledine Brewery, which was out on College Street, College and Fort. There in western Springfield, and they found one of those lagering caves. You can still take lagering cave tours in St. Louis, and the Limp Brewery, and of course the Budweiser Brewery, all of those connections. The Germans change how we drink because lager can be mass produced easier. It doesn't necessarily spoil. And by the 1870s and 80s, with the refrigerated rail car, you can transport beer around the country. But in the 1850s, the Germans
worry about it exploding as you change heat.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But in the 1850s, the Germans go to their beer gardens and they have dances and they enjoy the Sunday afternoon. And that makes the Americans, the Native Americans, quote unquote, very upset because they feel that they're disrespecting their religion. We see some communities pass what we know as blue laws, and I'm sure some of your listeners probably remember blue laws where certain things could not be served on Sunday. I do too. And there was tension between the communities over that, tension over German language religious services. And again, the Germans are bringing that cultural tradition with them. Martin Luther is attributed with a quote that says, "He who does not love wine, women, and song remains a fool their whole life long." And Luther definitely loved his beer. His wife was a brewer. And it's a tradition that they bring with them, and they see nothing wrong with doing it. They also bring wine cultivation, and that's very important to our story because once you get up into the Missouri River Valley mimics wine production areas in Germany like the Rhineland. And so in the Herman area, we start to see vineyards popping up everywhere until by the 1880s and 1890s, Missouri was actually one of the largest wine producing states in the United States.
up until Prohibition. Then, of course, Prohibition does away with a lot of that. And then, of course, California takes over in the 60s and 70s. But it was Missouri that saved the French winemaking industry from a blight right around the turn of the 20th century by sending cuttings of vines. It's Missouri that leads the nation in production. And a lot of that is, again, due to those Germans that are that are celebrating their culture, their life, and doing what most immigrants do. They're celebrating the fact that they survived,
Sure.
harsh conditions. Well, all of these tensions really lead to, as you hinted a minute ago, to the Civil War. And of course, the Germans are abolitionists, largely Republicans. Their neighbors in Missouri, mostly Scots-Irish, mostly rural. And by the way, the Germans are mostly rural too. We do have a fairly strong German colony in St. Louis on the Mississippi River. And then also down in St. Genevieve, the first French settlement in Missouri becomes overwhelmingly German at one point. But most Germans in Missouri are rural farmers. But their neighbors, the Scots-Irish, start referring to them as the Dutch, the damned Dutch, all sorts of insults and pejorative terms because of this dividing line between slave and free, Democrat and Republican, and that ultimately spills over into the American Civil War. And of course, when war breaks out in 1861, Missouri is here at literally the crossroads of the Mississippi and Missouri River. It's a strategic choke point. St. Louis is a very urban industrial area. There's concern that if Missouri falls into Confederate hands, that could severely hurt or even end the Union war effort. And so the overall Union commander on the ground in Missouri, General Nathaniel Lyon, looks to the Germans of St. Louis to be the first recruits for the Union Army, and they embrace the cause. And remember, I mentioned the shooting clubs and the turners, almost a paramilitary tradition. The Germans bring with them that
No kidding.
And they start to form what Lyon calls the Home Guard and the Reserve Corps. And so when tensions boil over in the spring of 1861, it's the Germans that are right there on the Union side, and they start recruiting Missouri Union regiments. It's interesting to note as an aside, but it's related, that in the Civil War, Missouri produces about 110 to 120,000 soldiers for the Union cause, and about 40,000 for the Confederacy. So I think that tells us a lot about where Missouri's loyalty lies in some ways, and how fractured it was. But Lyon's Germans accompany him on the first major campaign in Missouri, which we call the Wilson's Creek Campaign, which starts up in St. Louis in May of 1861 with the Camp Jackson massacre, where the entire state militia essentially was captured by Lyon's Home Guard and then marched through the streets of St. Louis, and shots were fired, rocks were thrown, and 28 people were killed as a result of that. Missouri remained largely moderate up until that time period, and then that kind of pushed some people over the edge. But Lyon makes it his mission to protect Missouri, keep the pro-Confederate Governor Claiborne Jackson from taking Missouri out of the Union, and he chases pro-Confederate Missouri State Guard forces literally all the way down to the southwest corner of the state, and that culminates in the battle that we know as Wilson's Creek on August 10th of 1861. Lyon's second in command, essentially, is Franz Sigel, who is commanding German troops, and there are a number of German regiments, a number of 48ers in their ranks there on the slopes of Bloody Hill. Sigel doesn't fare too well in the battle, but one thing that Sigel is very good at, he's not a very good military field commander, but he's a very good recruiting sergeant. And the cry, "I goes to fight mit Sigel," which becomes a parody song of the time period, really speaks to the fact that Sigel and others are able to bring these Germans aboard on the Union cause. And Germans fight at battles like Wilson's Creek, Carthage, Lexington, Pea Ridge in Arkansas, Prairie Grove. You'll literally find them all over the map, serving in regiments. They serve in regiments from New York and Ohio. There are German regiments from Wisconsin.
The Wisconsin,
You know,
the Wisconsin boys were in were stationed around Springfield at one point.
yeah, there were several Wisconsin regiments that were here. There were Wisconsin regiments at the Battle of Prairie Grove. You'll find a number of Germans in Iowa regiments from there along the Mississippi River.
Right.
But they certainly, I think, are one of the keys. The Union Army in the Civil War was one of the most ethnically diverse armies I think the United States has ever fielded. Germans, other immigrant populations, the United States colored troops, so African Americans, former slaves, and freemen that were had officers who were of German heritage in many instances.
Borders in German.
Well, yeah, exactly. And in fact, one of the neat things that Wilson's Creek has in its collection is a German manual of arms. It's a drill book, essentially, that those home guards and those reserve corps used in 1861 to train. And they were speaking German. They were using those commands. It would have been brought from home. Those 48ers like Siegel and Hassendubel and Backoff and others had that military experience from fighting the Prussians, and they brought them to the battlefields of North America. And of course, they were also heavily involved in the Reconstruction period when the radical Republicans, after Lincoln's assassination, really sought to bring the whole Civil War to an end and really not allow secession to survive, the secessionists to survive. So the Republicans are definitely involved, or the Germans are definitely involved in Republican politics all the way into the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. Now, we go back to the first of the podcast, and I mentioned really quickly 1870, 71, and German unification. So those 30 patchwork states come together and they form a new country. And a lot of that is under the direction of Prussia. Prussia has just won 3 major conflicts against the French, the Austrians, and the Danes. And they have really solidified their control over northeastern Europe. And now the other German states start to see Prussia as a potential protector, and supporters of German nationalism start appealing to common language. They start speaking to common culture. Shouldn't we be one country? The Italians go through the same thing in the 1860s. And a lot of it, again, is due to the 1840s, the 1848 revolution. But by 1871, we have a new nation, Germany, that has a monarchy under the Prussian monarchy and a very intelligent prime minister named Otto von Bismarck, who's the author of all of this. How this relates to the United States is, of course, the United States is watching this, and there's a brief flirtation with all things German in the United States. Most people don't realize that in the 1880s, the American Army dress uniform contained a helmet with a spike on it, a pickelhaube, essentially, like the German helmets of the day. Right. And the American Army attaché in Paris was actually mobbed by a group of Frenchmen while he was wearing his helmet, because they had just literally went through the siege of Paris and the Franco-Prussian War, and they didn't like the fact that this Yankee was wearing something that reminded them of their Prussian overlords. But German immigrants and their children, now that they've been in the United States, are watching this, and there's a sense of pride. I mean, they feel pride in the fact that their homeland has become united, and they feel pride in their language, and they're still maintaining a lot of their identity. What they don't realize, of course, is that nationalism is leading Europe on a very fast course, essentially, to another conflict. Europe has not been engaged in a full-scale continental conflict since 1815. About 100 years later, of course, we have what we know as the First World War, the World War at that time. And not to go too deep in the weeds, but if you remember from your high school history class, there were 2 alliances, the Germans, the Austrians on one side, and the Ottoman Empire, and then the Russians, the French, and the British on the other. And there's a flashpoint in Serbia, and well, actually in Sarajevo in Bosnia, where a Serbian nationalist kills an Austrian archduke, and the alliance kicks in, and it's too late to stop, and it's essentially a form of mutual assured destruction, where all of Europe gets sucked into this conflict, and even states that try to remain neutral, like poor little Belgium, get sucked into it, and that brings the British in. Well, the American population is watching all of this, and there's sympathy. The Germans in the upper Midwest are obviously somewhat sympathetic to their homeland. Not everybody is, but they obviously feel that sympathy. If you're a New Englander or a Southerner of British descent, you're probably going to have a lot more sympathy with the Allies. There's a lot of references to how the French helped the American Revolution and Lafayette, we are here. The Americans remain neutral. Woodrow Wilson runs on the campaign in 1916 that he's going to keep us out of war. And there are a lot of Americans that don't want to be involved, but they feel like they're being sucked into it. And in 1915, the Lusitania is torpedoed, and there are a number of American citizens on the Lusitania that are killed when the U-boat, the German undersea boat, the submarine, sinks the Lusitania, and that's considered to be barbaric. And there are references coming out of Belgium of Germans committing all sorts of atrocities, and the British and the French start calling them the Hun or the Boche, the pig. And the Germans want to spread their idea of culture, and culture usually comes at the end of a bayonet point. And all of this kind of building up. And then in 1917, right before America enters the war, news is leaked about something called the Zimmermann telegram. And Zimmermann was a foreign minister of Germany who had contacted the Mexican government and basically had said, hey, Mexico, if you come into the war against the United States with us, we'll give you back Germany, or we'll give you back Arizona, Texas, and New Mexico. And of course, America and Mexico had been having tensions in 1916 and whatnot. So when the news leaks, and no doubt it was leaked for a reason, that really turns most Americans against Germany. And finally, in April of 1917, Woodrow Wilson declares war. And we're going to go to war not for conquest, but to make the world safe for democracy. That's the byline. So we go from he kept us out of war to making the world safe for democracy. Well, the ironic thing is that the Wilson administration creates a propaganda machine of its own. It's called the Committee on Public Information, the CPI, and it's headed by a guy named George Creel. Well, the CPI starts coming down very heavily on German Americans. And it gets a lot of ordinary Americans to get on that bandwagon as well. And so all of a sudden, if you're a German, you can't speak German on the telephone in Iowa. That's literally a law in Iowa, that German is forbidden over the telephone. If you go to a German Lutheran church, you're probably not going to attend divine services that are spoken in German. If you go to a restaurant and you want to order some sort of traditional German dish, it's not going to be sauerkraut. It's going to be Liberty cabbage. And my dog, who's in the other room, would have his breed name changed from Dachshund to Liberty Hound. And the German culture, the German identity, in many cases, were essentially wiped out. Germans stopped doing these traditional German things. They stopped holding their Singvereins, and they stopped going to the Turner clubs and the Schutzvereins. They stopped going to the German-speaking churches. They changed their names.
My own grandfather and my great-grandfather, Carl with a K, Champion Heron, changed it to Carl with a C, and then his son, Klein Champion Heron Sr., Klein, changed it to, actually it was Kline, now that I think about it, but it was changed to Cline, which is a anglicized version. It's more Irish, I think, than anything.
One of the most famous American aces, fighter aces of World War I, who shot down 26 planes, was a fellow named Eddie Rickenbacker. He was of Swiss heritage, and his last name was originally Rickenbacker. Bacher, but he changed it to Backer and changed the pronunciation of it. Because again, we're talking about this persecution of a people who may or may not have been spies or fifth columnists. There were all sorts of charges of that. And no doubt there were some Germans who probably were pro-German. We don't really know how many of them may have returned to the fatherland to fight for the Kaiser or to fight for the new nation. Most of them ended up fighting for the United States. I mean, you'll find quite a few Missouri Germans enlisting in the U.S. Army and serving in the 35th Division, which was the Missouri-Kansas National Guard Division, and they're just as loyal and just as patriotic. Kind of an interesting relation to that. I have an image of a postcard that was printed in 1916 down in Texas, and it's for a German war relief rally, and it shows on the postcard the Alamo. And on one side of it is a portrait of the Kaiser Wilhelm, and on the other side of it is Franz Joseph, the Emperor of Austria. And everything is written in German in Teutonic script. And there's the Alamo. I mean, probably one of the most iconic images of American history, the Alamo, and the Germans are using it as a way to recruit people to bring people in to raise money for German war relief. So kind of an interesting aside there.
Some of those dime novels, though, were widely read in Europe.
Well, and
they were translated.
Yes, and the Germans have a very strong love for Western history and frontier culture to this day. There was a strong attraction, and I think a lot of that's due to Duden and these people going out on the Western frontier in the United States and sending word back. And, you know, they were enthralled by gunfighters and the story of the West. And there's some reenacting villages and Old West villages in Germany to this day, kind of like how we're obsessed about certain things. But that anti-German hysteria of World War I really, I think, puts a lot of German culture on the back burner. And then in 1918 and 1919, you have the double whammy of the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act, which brings about prohibition. And of course, this is the Germans' worst nightmare. And of course, they don't always pay attention to it, obviously. And there are ways around it. Breweries can produce other things, and wineries can produce sacramental wine, or they can make root beer, or they can make medicine. And some of the more savvy ones survive.
Mushrooms and asparagus was what they did with the Stone Hill cellars.
Yeah, exactly. And perfect place to grow those things. And that's a way to survive until, the nightmare of prohibition ends in 1933. And as the song goes, happy days are here again. But, there were all of those things that really, I think, pushed a lot of second and third generation German Americans to just become Americans. And the identity slowly slips away. The name changes. The language is not as common. My grandmother remembered the anti-German hysteria of World War I. She was a little girl in World War I, but then she remembered very well some of it coming back in Iowa in World War II. Not as common as World War I. The Japanese were vilified, and the wrongs that were done to the Japanese Americans, of course, are another story in that right. But she remembered some of that. She remembered some of those things, and again, people being afraid to say who they were and where they came from. I think that's.
So let me ask you a question, because there's a distinction here. We've already identified that there, and let me set this up for you. So we talked about over the years how the Scots-Irish, or even the early Irish, did not necessarily maintain that Irish identity or Scots-Irish identity. I think I really probably just talking about Scots-Irish here. So they did not maintain that. They had lost. They didn't even realize they were Germans in many cases by the time they get to immigrating toward Missouri. They just know that it seems like the later Germans held on to their culture longer than the ones that arrived. The 48ers versus the one that arrived in even early America or colonial times.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Or
am I getting a wrong
I think that's
impression?
very fair to say. No, I think that's very fair to say. I think you're spot on. The first Germans were really more religious groups that were persecuted, the Amish, the Mennonites, to a lesser degree, the Moravians. The Moravians, by the way, did a lot of work with Native Americans on the frontier, which made them very suspicious, kind of like the Quakers. The Scots-Irish Indian fighters were not happy about William Penn and the Moravians, and some of their actions in that regard. But yeah, I think that's fair to say. Again, think about a settlement like Herman, where it's designed to be a little Germany on the Missouri. It's designed to recreate Germany, where Germans can be a part of the new country, but on the same token can retain their culture, only to have that culture basically wiped away in the aftermath of the First World War. We kind of see a little bit of that in the Second World War, although a lot of German Americans serve in the American Army. And of course, think about these folks who might have grown up speaking German as children, and now their services can be translators when they're and they're going to visit family. I mean, we hear about that all the time, of GIs going to the town where their family was from, or looking for ancestors.
Yeah.
That may have been
Saving Private Ryan.
It is, and it's a subplot in a lot of
a German farm kid, or a kid that grew up in a German-speaking farm community in the United States, I guess.
He talks about his accent, his Bavarian accent, and that's kind of interesting. A good lead-in with Bavaria, and I mentioned Bavaria earlier. So we're talking about ways to promote German identity. Today, when we think of German identity, when we go to a festival like Oktoberfest in Herman, or Erntefest, which will be next month in Freistadt, down in Lawrence County, what do we see? We see people wearing drindles. We see ladies wearing drindles, and we see gentlemen wearing lederhosen and Triolian hats. Right. And here's the thing. That costuming is really for one particular geographic region, Bavaria, and a little bit of spillover into Austria. My ancestors, who were from up around the German-Danish border, would have probably never worn it. They would have looked like Danish fishermen. But the Bavarian culture won out. And here's the thing that relates to our, the subject of the blog. Northern Germans tend to view Bavarians as hillbillies. I mean, they have that same stereotype that the Bavarians are backward and they live up in the mountains, and they even have, and you can see them in Oktoberfest, what look like hillbilly hats, the stereotypical hillbilly hat that you'd find in Branson, but it's a Bavarian Oktoberfest hat. And my son had one when he was little that we got from an Oktoberfest somewhere, and it again kind of speaks to that created culture in some ways after World War II. As more people wanted to go back and find out where they were from, they looked to something that may or may not have been theirs, but it became their identity. So when you go to Oktoberfest, and I, full disclosure, I have a full set of lederhosen, love wearing it. I think it's cool. I'm not Bavarian, but that's okay. I mean, it's not necessarily, no one's going to check my German identity card to find out whether
submit your ancestry profile.
Right, exactly. And that's not the point. But
right,
we
also belong to the Scottish Society, and we wear Highland gear and attire, and most of us are lowlanders, or not even really Scottish in a lot of ways.
Lowlanders would have never worn kilts, just like, a Prussian would have not worn lederhosen. They might have worn something similar, but what we traditionally think of
lederhosen is what? It is not just traditional guard. It's leather shorts, rugged leather shorts, and it's made for work. They're work clothes or sporting clothes, because you have you have to carry things in Germany.
And then also too, it becomes a ceremonial garb, because there are all of these ceremonies and festivals, and it may be a religious festival like St. Martin's Day, or the start of the hunting season. There's a tradition in Germany of blessing the rifles on the hunting season, the Jaegers, the hunters, and the Stag's Head, that sort of thing. And so that
By the way,
became
for all of you that got
yeah.
bombed on Jägermeister in college, it means Master Hunter.
And it was a medicine, actually. It was,
It was a tonic from, keep you from freezing to death.
exactly. So, what was once utilitarian, and the Germans are very big on utilitarian. They're not
Right.
big on fancy folderol. Think about
Elegance
the
is simplicity.
Yes, and think about the kitchen gardens, and think about their style of architecture. If you go up to Herman and you go to Deutsheim State Historic Site and you see the buildings from the 1840s and 50s, very utilitarian, beautiful in their own way, but everything has a purpose. Well,
Right.
over time, some of that does develop into more traditional symbolic sort of dress, and of course lederhosen, a working garb, becomes something that you wear to the festival or the service to show off, so to speak. And even the Gamsbart, the tuft of deer hair or fur, or the feather that's worn in the hat, that symbolizes certain things, and it's a rite of passage. So I encourage folks, I really hope that, you get out to one of these. Herman is probably the most well known with its Oktoberfest and Maifest and other things, but St. Charles and Freistadt and Kohlkamp and all of these places do have elements of these German festivals that are fun to visit and fun to experience. And probably the one that most people know of, and again, here's where the influence comes in strong in American society, are the Christmas markets. Herman holds
I'll tell you, the
Christmas
Herman one
market.
is outstanding.
It is. And again, think about your Christmas traditions. And here's something interesting. So in the early 19th century, there were strict laws on forestry in Germany. And you could not cut down a Christmas tree in certain German states because it was illegal. So the Germans, being industrious, came up with two substitutes. They came up with a barrel stave Christmas tree, which our mutual friend of ours, Mike Boozy Cruz, made one year. And it's literally a barrel cut apart, and the barrel staves are the branches with candles on the end of it. Or the Germans made what are called feather trees. And they literally would take goose feathers, dye them green, twist them like pipe cleaners, and they essentially made the first artificial trees. And of course, it's the Germans that introduced
Christmas decorations. If you own old Christmas decorations, and I mean prior to World War II, chances are a lot of them are made in Germany.
Exactly. But I will say the Christmas pickle tradition is not German. It's probably German American, but you hear it a lot. The bird in the Christmas tree, though, I think is very German. And of course, there's some stories that Martin Luther created the first Christmas tree. Again, probably not, but we know that the German immigrants bring our customs of Christmas that we know today. And of course, I always reference that when I talk about Christmas customs. It's, St. Nicholas comes to us from the Dutch. Washington Irving gives us that. The Civil War, with the German cartoonist Thomas Nast, gives us the American version of Santa Claus, Sinterklaas, and he brings a Christmas tree that the Germans introduced, and the first Christmas tree in America that some historians believe was in Philadelphia. The Germans even have, some of the Germans have a tradition of hanging their Christmas trees upside down from the ceiling.
Yeah, I've seen that.
And it's very common. And again, it's practical. It keeps children and animals from bothering the ornaments. But
I think we're almost getting ready to talk ourselves into a Christmas culture episode, which I want to do anyway.
Yeah, and I think that would be good.
There's a lot there, particularly if you look at the Ozarks and then you look kind of at the broader area to understand it.
The point being is that there are remnants of German culture scattered throughout America today, and we think of them as American. I mean, what's more American than the hamburger, the Hamburg sandwich? Right. Yes, it looks a little different in Hamburg, but some people believe that it was German sailors from Hamburg that introduced the idea of the Hamburg sandwich, which became the hamburger. For those of you,
the hot dog.
The hot dog, the Frankfurter, the bratwurst. I mean, those
The
are
hot
all.
dog.
Yeah, and
I'll tell you a funny story. Just demonstrates this. My father was stationed in the Army of Occupation all through the latter part of 54 and then through 55 until early 56. He was there just about 14 months. And they were bivouacked. They were an artillery unit. And so they're bivouacked up out in the Alps. And the German children had taken the spent shells, artillery shells from the last war, and they had them made into lunch boxes. And they would drop a bottle of beer in, and they would put sticks of yeast and sticks of bread. And if you gave them like 20 cents, they'd go down to town and get it for you and bring it back. And and Dad said we were eating hot dogs, basically. Took my knife and cut it as a hot dog.
How many of those GIs brought German war brides back to the United States, and they opened German restaurants, and it was quite common. I mean, think about it. I like to point this out all the time. Samuel Adams Boston Lager, which has an American patriot's name on it, the center of the American Revolution. The founder of the Boston Brewery, Jim Koch, Koch, excuse me, was the descendant of Cincinnati brewers. The Boston Lager is really a Cincinnati or St. Louis beer that Germans produce. I mean, he really admits it. And so that's, again, we drink German beer, we eat German food, we celebrate with German Christmas traditions, we send our kids to German kindergarten. You know, I'm not trying to
our cheese tradition is German. Our hunting tradition is German, by and large.
Missouri,
our holidays, I mean,
yep. Well,
the list just goes on and on.
Missouri today has the German corridor, which runs along Highway 94 from St. Charles out to Warren County, Washington, and then goes on along the Missouri River all the way out to Lexington in Lafayette County. That's the Rhineland, the Missouri Rhineland. The Highway 94 is literally called the Weinstrasse, the wine road. And if you want to get a little taste of Germany and Missouri, I mean, make a trip up there, hit the wineries, visit Herman, go to these places, and you'll still see those German churches built among the hills, and you'll still hear about the German clubs they're meeting. I believe there's still a Turner Club in St. Louis that still meets. I know the German Cultural Society is very active, and shameless plug, the Deutschmeister Brass Band in St. Louis is probably one of the best polka bands I've ever heard. That plays at Bevo Mill, which is right there in South St. Louis. It was a stopping off point for Adolphus Busch going from the brewery out to Grant's Farm. And he literally wanted a place to stop and have a beer. So they built Bevo Mill. And in Prohibition, Bevo was the name of the near beer that AB produced for a while. Mm-hmm. But you just can't, you can't really look around without seeing some German influence on Missouri and the Ozarks today. It's not as common, but even down at a little town like Billings, which doesn't really have a lot of overt German signs, you go to St. Peter United Church of Christ, which was the German Protestant church. German is written on the wall. They have a German Advent service every year in conjunction with the German Austrian Swiss Society. So it's still there. It's still there, and there are dedicated folks that are proud of it and keeping it alive. And I think that's what's so great about it. And it makes me enjoy it, and it makes me proud of what little German heritage I have when they were really Swedes. But that's another story, and that's all right. I mean,
don't look very Nordic if it's just to be truthful about it. You don't look
well. My grandfather really didn't either. I mean, and he was the Yoakum. I mean, and there's the Ozark connection too. I mean, the Yokums were Swedes, but they intermarried with the Pennsylvania Dutch, and they became Pennsylvania Dutch just like everyone else did. And
we at first time think that the Yokums were like Czechoslovakian or Yugoslavian, and then we found out later they're Swedes. What was that?
There's a story that the Yokum's dollar, comes from a region in Moravia, which is part of Czechoslovakia. And it could be.
Moravia. It was in Czechoslovakia. Okay.
But I think that the fact that the first Joe come into the United States is a Swede in New Sweden, which is in Pennsylvania. And of course, as I like to point out, the Delaware at Delaware Town down in Christian County were also from Pennsylvania. Their chief, William Anderson, was more Swedish than Delaware. It makes sense. I think there's a lot of Pennsylvania culture in the Ozarks that doesn't get talked about as much. I think that original Ozarks culture has just as much of its roots in Pennsylvania as it does the Upper South.
I completely agree. I completely agree because funny thing, and I don't want to drone on and on and on about witchcraft, but I was speaking with a powwow doctor who was giving me some, just explaining some things to me. We were just talking over the phone. Nice fella. And he said that now they so eradicated, and I'm just going to use a very broad brush, air quotes term here, German folk magic. They so eradicated it that there is no cultural memory of that in Germany at this point. And so people are coming from Germany to Pennsylvania to learn different aspects of German culture. It's not just magic. There's other things too.
And they're doing it for other cultures too. I mean, the Missouri French, the Pawpaw French dialect of the first French settlers in Missouri is being studied by French linguists in Quebec and Paris and other areas. And there's hardly anybody who speaks Pawpaw French to this day. But you go over into St. Genevieve and Kaskaskia in Illinois and other places, and they're still practicing French customs like the 12th night custom and the New Year's levy and those sort of things. And again, I think that, to kind of put a head on it, to wrap things up a little bit, it's fun to go on these detective hunts and find out where things originated and find where these groups came from and how they still survive and how they influence us. And they really contribute to what makes America such an interesting place. The Germans came in and they celebrated our strengths. They pointed out our weaknesses. Carl Schurz, who was an German American politician and Civil War soldier, has, I think, one of the best definitions of patriotism. He says, "My country, right or wrong, when right, to be left right, when wrong, to be put right." And I think that kind of speaks well to what the Germans do. They come in and they introduce some good ideas. They support us. They are unfairly maligned in many ways, but at the end of the day, they've contributed so much. And now here in Missouri, the German contribution brings in tourist dollars. It brings in economic success to communities like Herman and other places. What a great legacy. And
that was the old, you remember the joke we used to tell amongst ourselves, the only way the British monarchy has survived is because they brought in German managers.
or there's the old joke about the British businessman who goes to Berlin after the war, and he checks into a hotel, and the next morning he comes down to the front clerk, the desk clerk, and he says, "I couldn't sleep all night. The trains were just constantly going, the rumble of trains." And the front clerk said, no, sir, it wasn't that. He said, "You understand that German workers are so polite that what you actually heard was Dankeschön, bitteschön, Dankeschön, bitteschön, Dankeschön, bitteschön," as the German workers handed each other bricks and mortar to rebuild the buildings. Not to make light of that, but again, I think it speaks a lot. Resilience, order, utilitarianism, but then at the end of the day, being able to go to the beer garden, lift a cold one,
stable communities, stable communities, stable towns, stable local government, stable schools. That's the the Germans make stability.
And civic culture, civic pride, and maybe that's the other watchword too. Champ, I think we talked about that.
I want to thank you for coming on and unpacking the Germans in America, and in particularly the Ozarks. I'll tell you what we're going to do. I know you've got some pictures and things we'll use on Facebook over there. We will also, I'm going to try to put together, may not be comprehensive, but let's try to put together some German festivals that they can attend. And then
Yes.
if you've got one and we miss it, please send it to us either through Messenger on Facebook or at Wild N Woolly Ozarks at gmail.com. I want to thank you again for listening as Todd has opened up the Germans in the Ozarks and in Missouri. It's a very interesting topic, and we see the effects of it every day, whether we realize or not. So thank you all for coming by today. Thank you for your downloads of our past episodes and those 5-star reviews. Keep them coming. We appreciate it. We have gone up in numbers on both Apple and Spotify, and we continue to rise. We're at over I checked this morning, 1,553 followers on Facebook, which roughly a year ago, we were at 240. So most of that has been since the podcast has been active, and probably the bulk of that is from the time period where we've brought the podcast back as volume 2. Todd's going to be coming back. We're going to talk some more about the Civil War, and we're going to talk about old Daniel Boone. And then Todd's got another episode up his sleeve or two. I'm now inviting you and putting the holiday traditions one on there because I think that would be a great one. And
we can do that.
And I want to do it. We're also working on an episode about old Christmas together.
Maybe we'll have a virtual visit from St. Nicholas.
Well, that could be. We also might have rather a crowd of our like-minded Ozark friends. So I've got a cabin picked out in the woods. We're gonna do it. But anyway, that's in the works. Because we're gonna do it. I hate listening to this thing. I listen to it to make sure it's coming off correctly, but I found out that I overuse we're gonna, and so oh my. So
thank you, Champ, for having me on, and we'll see you on the river.
Well, Todd, until next time, would you take us home the old Mitch Janeway?
Well, folks, be good to the tourists.
Y'all be careful. Bye now, folks.